Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I am Harold Mock, Director of Georgia College's Leadership Programs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Usery Forum on Leadership featuring Dr. Dana Winters. Before I begin, I need to tell you that this event is being recorded and streamed. By participating in this program, you are consenting to being recorded. If you would prefer to view the recording instead of participating, please leave this meeting and email leadership.programs@gcsu.edu. That said, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Dana Winters to Georgia College to speak in our Usery Forum on Leadership. Anaga Ramakrishnan will introduce our distinguished guest momentarily, but first allow me briefly to say a few words about this event. The Usery Forum is named for the 15th U.S. Secretary of Labor, W.J. Usery, Jr., and it has a goal of exploring leadership that brings people together, as Secretary Usery did across his career, working to solve challenges both at home and abroad and to build meaningful relationships around the world. This series is made possible with a generous gift from Melvin and Lisa Usery, to whom we express our continuing gratitude. In particular, Mrs. Usery served for many years as a school teacher, so I'm particularly glad to welcome a distinguished educator such as Dr. Winters to Georgia College as part of this series. Likewise, our thanks go to our co-sponsors for this event, the Sandra Dunnigan Deal Center for Early Language and Literacy at Georgia College, and to the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges. One of the most important parts of our Usery Forum is that we get to hear from you, from our guests. So as we hear Dr. Winters present this afternoon, I encourage you to think about what it is that she might be sharing that you have a follow-up question about. What's something you'd like to ask her to revisit or to help explain a bit further. We rely on your good questions to make this an exciting event. In her role as Executive Director of the Fred Rogers Center, Dr. Winters works to honor and to promote the legacy of Fred Rogers, of Mr. Rogers. From his early use of television and educational technology to his commitment to the power of human connection, Mr. Rogers was, for so many of us, one of the most important teachers of our childhood. Even now, decades later, I think almost daily of things that I learned because of Mr. Rogers, including how crayons are made. Some of you may remember that yourselves. So in that spirit, I encourage you to take a pack of crayons and create something exciting with them. That said, I want to thank you all for being here and welcome, of course, Dr. Winters. Now, Anaga Ramakrishnan, who is our Usery Fellow, will introduce Dr. Winters.
Good evening. As the Executive Director of the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning and Children's Media, Dana Winters seeks to apply and advance the legacy of Fred Rogers in serving children and their helpers. Through projects involving children's helpers across many diverse settings, including childcare, school systems, community programs, residential care, and children's hospitals, she communicates and reflects what is simple and deep about work and service of children and their families. Winters supervises the center's research lab, Incubator 143, which partners with educators, trainers, advocates, and researchers to focus on identifying and amplifying the simple active ingredient that universally helps serve children, the power of human connection. She joined the center after serving as a senior evaluator for the Collaborative for Evaluation and Assessment Capacity at the University of Pittsburgh's School of Education and as an education counselor with the Educational Opportunity Centers of Penn State University. Winters holds a Ph.D. in Administrative and Policy Studies from the University of Pittsburgh, an M.A. in Education from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and a BA in Sociology from St. Vincent College. Please join me in welcoming Dana Winters to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. One reason in particular is this is the first time that I have traveled outside of Western Pennsylvania in 19 months, 1 week, and 6 days, but who's counting? It's nice to be back in person and to see at least eyeballs of faces and some smiling faces as well. I appreciate so much the opportunity to be with you tonight. As Annika mentioned and Harold mentioned, I am from the Fred Rogers Center. How many of you grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood with your children and grandchildren? And all right, so we're about 50-50. I expected that. Now, I teach at a small college in Pittsburgh where we'd have a few more hands up because Mr. Rogers is a rite of passage still for our college students. But I'm not surprised that some of you may never have heard of Mr. Rogers. My guess is that many of you were born after he was already off the air. And at the Fred Rogers Center, we're committed to making sure that his legacy remains alive, even though Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is only shown at 6 a.m. on PBS in certain markets still. Now, at the center, I like to say that I'm in the business of thinking about Fred outside of the sweater. Now, that might not make sense to some of you, but I'd like to start today with a look at what it felt like and looked like when Fred went into the sweater over 30 plus years of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So we'll take a little trip down memory lane to start here. I call this Fred through the years. And I'll tell you, when I have talked before with educators, I've asked them to put their hand up when they see a Fred that is recognizable to them, until I realize that's a horrible way to start a relationship with a group of people, because I'm asking you to tell me your age immediately, and so we're not going to do that here tonight. But I'll be able to know when you see a Fred of your childhood. You get that warm, fuzzy face. I know exactly what it is. And for those of you, this is the first time. I hope you can see a little bit of what made Fred Rogers a little bit special when it came to children's television programming. So for those of you who are seeing this for the first time, imagine that you're a young child. Imagine you're 3 or 4 years old, and you're curled up in the lap of somebody that you love, and you're watching this on television, not on the DVR, but you've got to run to make sure you catch it live, because it's only shown once per day, and you can't rewind. And this is how he would have introduced himself every single day to you as you watched.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?
So Mr. Rogers was a children's television host for over 895 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. At the end, you met Daniel Tiger, the puppet. And when we think about Fred Rogers, oftentimes we're met with a flood of nostalgia for a simpler time, maybe a time when things felt a little bit slower. As you can see, there weren't a lot of bright colors and flashing symbols there. It's a little different from children's television today. But what we see is a deep intentionality of understanding the needs of children. Mr. Rogers entered from the left and moved to the right at the beginning of every episode because he was helping children's eyes be ready to read from left to right. That level of intention went into every single episode. Now, that level of intention went into every single day of Fred Rogers' life. And when Harold approached me about coming to speak here today, which was going to be in the spring and possibly virtual, in the fall and possibly virtual, and I'm so glad that we're in person, began to think, what on earth could I offer? What on earth could I talk about that might be helpful to a generation of college students who are unfamiliar with Mr. Rogers, and to a group of adults who might remember Mr. Rogers from their own childhood or from the childhood of their own children, and might not see the transfer to now. So I started to think a little bit about my own work that I've done in service of Fred's legacy, and not in an attempt to be the next Mr. Rogers, of course, but in an attempt to think very deeply about what he communicated across 30 plus years, both inside the sweater on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and outside the sweater as a humanitarian and a public intellectual. And what I'd like to do is share with you tonight some of the lessons I've learned personally from Fred Rogers, and some of the lessons I've learned in applying that work in service of others over the last decade of my career. Now, at the Fred Rogers Center, we don't work directly with children. Even though Mr. Rogers spoke directly to children through his television program, instead, we support children's helpers. And what does it mean to support the helpers? Well, if you have ever heard of Fred Rogers, my guess is you've heard of the infamous quote of "look for the helpers." You may have heard that without knowing that it was Fred Rogers. And the story goes that when Fred was a young boy and he was afraid, he asked his mother, "What do I do when I'm scared? What do I do when I'm afraid?" And she told him to always look for the helpers, because you'll always see someone helping. Now, that's the part we hear more now. That's the part we've heard a lot in the last 19 months. I think they've painted a mural of "Look for the Helpers" in Virginia Beach. We see that in the news. But the interview went on. And when Fred was describing why we look for the helpers, this is the reason why at the center we've devoted our work to the helpers. And it's because when we see people helping, and when you look for the helpers, you'll know there is hope. So for us, helpers, well, they're anyone who supports the healthy development of other people, whether those other people be children or youth or other adults. It's the helpers who are out there bringing so much hope that we've seen, of course, over the last 19 months, but before that as well. I'm very lucky that my work has introduced me to so many helpers around the world, from working in family child care to being able to serve in orphanage environments overseas, to public schools, both urban, rural, suburban, to village preschools in rural China, to schools that support students with developmental delays and disabilities, and children's hospitals and communities. That there's been some rather unlikely places where we have found helpers supporting the needs of others. But it's all within that same understanding of why we do this work, which is the support of others because of the hope that they provide to so many. That's something I'd like to talk a little bit with you tonight. When I was thinking about the many, many ways I could frame a talk like this, thinking about the many, many quotes from Fred Rogers and the many speeches and the many opportunities that he had to talk to similar audiences, I landed on one particular speech that I'd like to frame our time together and think about a little bit. And it's a speech that Fred gave when he was inducted to the Television Hall of Fame, where he asked us to think about how we make goodness attractive. So when he gave the talk, he started by explaining that so much of what was on television at the time, this was in 1999, was very different than the television that he had been producing. And he challenged the many actors and producers and media makers within the audience to focus on what it means to make goodness attractive. And he said, but how do we make goodness attractive? By doing whatever we can to bring courage to those whose lives move near our own. By treating our neighbor at least as well as we treat ourselves, and allowing that to inform everything that we produce. So I'd like to pose that question to all of you this evening. But how do we make goodness attractive? There are many books, many things we can learn about what it means to be a leader, to bring leadership, to manage, to be a part, come alongside a team. Not many of those places do you see those words talking about goodness. So how do we make goodness attractive? Well, I'd like to start with 3 possible ideas of how we make goodness attractive. Number 1, learned directly from Fred Rogers, is we need to really try hard to see every person as more than just one thing. What does that mean? Well, in our times right now, it's easy to hear one thing about a person and think we know it all. We assume so much from many of the labels that we have. We assume to know one another by a simple description. But I challenge you to see each person as far more than just one thing. Fred challenged a group of pediatricians in 1989 to do the same, when he said, what's been important in my understanding of myself and others is the fact that each one of us is so much more than any one thing. A sick child is much more than his or her sickness. A person with a disability is much, much more than a handicap. A pediatrician is more than a medical doctor. You're much more than your job description or your age or your income or your output. And now this goes beyond just acknowledging one another as more than one thing. It means showing that type of empathy and understanding, compassion and kindness that comes with truly knowing another person. Oftentimes, Fred Rogers is linked directly to kindness. When we think of Fred Rogers, we think of kindness. But I think recently kindness has been reduced to being nice to one another, which is important. But Fred Rogers' level of kindness took into account something very different. He looked at the word kind and saw the root of that word as kin, as brother, sister, neighbor, which means it meant looking into another person and seeing that person as more than one thing, more than was just presented on the outside. And Fred did this with every single person that he met, regardless if it was on a street corner or if it was walking down the street, if it was in his office, if it was on the program. You instantly felt better after talking with Fred. You instantly felt known and seen. He showed us how to do this through Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood also, where he would invite guests to the program, have conversations with them, and always you would walk away saying, wow, I feel better after seeing how he treats other people. So I'd like to show you one of those moments. It's one of the more well-known moments of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And it's a visit with a young man by the name of Jeffrey Erlinger, who, as you can see, uses a wheelchair. Now, this episode came in the theme week around how things go, and was in the same episode as when they introduced us to an electric car. So this was a very different kind of electric car. This was in the early 1980s, so it was a very different electric car than what we thought of now, and we didn't see another one for probably 20 years after that. But I'd like you just to watch the interview with Jeff. And I want you to think about what it is you notice in this conversation and how he shows us what it means to see one another as more than just one thing. Now, they had not met previously. They'd talked on the phone. They'd sent letters to one another. And Fred invited Jeffrey onto the program, and his family was late, and so they weren't able to talk beforehand. And so the producers met with Jeffrey and said, whatever you do, it's fine. Just, have a conversation. You might sing a song, but don't use words that are too big. That's the only guideline. Try to use simple language. Well, take a look at what happens.
Do you know that song that I sung?
Well, not on that one because it's the wrong clip. You know what? They both are. That's all right. We'll work with what we've got here. Nope, not a problem at all. So in this clip, Fred talks with Jeffrey and is able to talk through many different parts of who Jeffrey is. And they talk about what it means to go to the doctor, talk about Jeffrey's parents being very proud of him. And they talk about how it is that Jeffrey comes to know his wheelchair. So what I'm going to do is very quickly come out of my slideshow to find the real clip. It's worth doing it. The good news is that I travel with a bunch of clips. All right, what do you say? Want to try it again? Here we go.
Mr. Rogers?
Hey, Jeff. I'm glad to see you. Thank you very much for coming by. I asked Jeff, this is my friend Jeff Erlinger. He's one of my neighbors here. And I asked him if he would come by today because I wanted you to meet him and I wanted you to see his electric wheelchair. We've been talking about electric cars and all kinds of things we've been thinking about this week. Would you show me how you make your chair go?
Okay, sure. Alright. Well, first, this is the on and off switch. I do this up to turn it on.
Okay.
And then
You're really good at that.
thanks.
It's a very fancy machine, but you're the one who makes it go.
Right.
Did it take a long time to learn how?
No, not really. I got the wheelchairs, and my first electric wheelchair only took me about a day to learn how to use it.
Gee, that's wonderful. Jeff, your mom and dad must be really proud of you.
I'm sure they are.
Yeah. Well, I know I am. Now, can you tell my friends what it is that made you need this wheelchair?
Sure. Well, when I was about 7 months old, I had a tumor, and it broke the nerves to tell my hands and legs what to do.
I see.
And they tried to cut the tumor, but they couldn't get it, and I became handicapped. And I got a wheelchair when I was 4 years old.
That was your first one
Mm-hmm.
when you were 4.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, sort of.
You must have some mighty good doctors who've been taking care of you.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell me any of your doctor's names?
Yeah, I have a pediatrician, Dr. Hansen, who works in Madison St. Mary's Hospital. And then at UW, I have the bone doctor's Dr. Green, who takes care of the bones, I guess, because he's a bone doctor. Anyway, I had surgery earlier this summer because I have pain in my stomach called autonomic dysreflexia, and I just
What was that?
autonomic dysreflexia. I'm not exactly sure what it means.
But you sure can say it.
Yeah. Anyway, so I had a surgery done just recently to try and cut the sphincter because it's holding my urine in. So, well, you have a lot of things going on when you're. This just shows you have a lot of things happen to you when you're handicapped most of the time. And sometimes it happens when you're not handicapped.
Of course. But you're able to talk about those things.
Yeah.
So well and help other people who might have the same kinds of things.
So more than just one thing. What did you notice when you watched it? Never talked about anything Jeffrey couldn't do. Never talked about limitations. Talked about everything Jeffrey can do. He makes that wheelchair go. His parents are proud of him. He affirmed that. He said, yes, yeah, of course they are. But what we saw was a conversation between two friends. Because Fred was able to show what it means when we see another person for more than how they present, as more than just one thing. Now at the end, this one I know is queued up correctly. I cut the clip there for a reason. Because what we see there is a moment between two people that could have happened anywhere. A moment that is completely unscripted, and a moment that is completely unedited. Because remember, he wasn't supposed to use big words. Autonomic dysreflexia. I don't know what it means, but I can say it. They didn't edit that out because it showed even more of who Jeffrey was as a young boy. And that was important for Fred to be able to show hundreds of thousands of children watching television about this isn't something to be afraid of, that we shouldn't fear difference, that we shouldn't fear the unknown, that we should listen, that we should ask questions, and we should get to know one another. We should see each other as more than just one thing. Now, when they wrapped up their time together, I mentioned earlier that they said, maybe we'll sing a song together. And this is how that moment ended.
Do you know that song that I sometimes sing called It's You I Like? I'd like to sing that to you and with you.
Okay, sure.
It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. Not the things that
I do.
not your fancy chair. That's just beside you. But it's you I like. Every part of you. Your skin, your eyes, your feelings. Whether old or new. I hope that you'll remember. Even when you're feeling blue, that must be times when you do feel blue.
Uh-huh.
What do you do during those times?
Well, it depends.
Sometimes do you make up stories,
Yeah,
or read,
yeah.
or play? I know that's the way I did when I was a little boy. Had all kinds of things that I
Did
would
it help?
It did help. Yeah. Does it help you?
Yeah.
We have to all discover our own ways, don't we,
Mm-hmm.
of doing things when we're feeling blue.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not feeling blue right now, though.
Me neither.
I'm so glad that you came today.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I hope you'll come back to visit again.
Okay.
Will you?
Yeah.
And will you give your mom and dad my best?
Sure.
Because they are sure great people.
Uh-huh. Bye.
Bye-bye, Jeff. I'll watch you as you go.
So the lyrics of that song, "It's you I like, every part of you." Kind of think about that for a long time. Those are lyrics written by Fred. It's music composed by Fred. But the message behind it is that just as you are enough. You are enough to be known, you're enough to be seen. Now, how does that play out today? Well, in the work that we do at the Fred Rogers Center when we support helpers, we don't ever assume to know what it is their work looks like, feels like, how they experience their work. The first thing we do anytime we enter into work with others is the only advice that Joanne Rogers ever gave me when it came to leading the center. When I asked her, "Are we doing this right? What should we do?" She'd say to me, "Dana, you know what Fred would say?" He'd say to listen first. Not come in with action right away, but listen first. Not only listen, but always start with listening. Because it's in listening that we're able to see one another, hear one another, and acknowledge one another as more than just one thing. Because when we're listening to understand, we see all of those many parts of one another. And we learn what it means to be in relationship with one another in a way that builds, does not destroy. So, first thing is, how do we see each other and how do we acknowledge each other as more than just one thing? The second thing is, how do we make goodness attractive? Well, by showing helpful appreciation. Now, helpful appreciation is something that Fred talked about as, how do we be helpful appreciators? He would talk about how there are a number of people in the world who are critical of others and think they're being helpful. And he called them the helpful critics. But how do we show appreciation for one another that helps us to grow from what is good? Helps us to see within ourselves what is good. And he said that there must be times when you wonder what in the world you can do. Yet you wanted so much to be of service that little by little the answer often comes to you, and you discover the way to be that helpful appreciator, which invariably makes the difference. The greatest thing we can do is to find what is healthy and laudable about somebody else and reflect that to them. It's a large assignment to be able to help people look deep within themselves and find what is wonderful there, because at the core of everyone is someone wonderful. It takes a lot more effort to look deep within others and reflect what is wonderful. But it's worth the effort to be that helpful appreciator which helps others to grow. Now, in the work that I do, I get to go to really unlikely places to find this type of appreciation and support happening, to see these relationships at play. And one of the projects that was my favorite, if I get to play favorites, is I got to spend about 6 months with all of the crossing guards in the city of Pittsburgh. Now, the crossing guards in the city of Pittsburgh are a little different than other places. They don't report to school systems. They report to the Department of Public Safety. So their boss is the chief of police, which means there's not a lot of child development and youth development training going on in their workplaces. They're taught how to safely cross people from one corner to the other, and they're measured in, outcomes are measured in pedestrian accidents, and that's pretty much all that they're looking for. However, we can see in action what it means to be a helpful appreciator of another person if you spend just 5 minutes watching some of our crossing guards in action. It's a place where you wouldn't expect to see leadership and mentoring and support of others. But I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Ms. Paula, who has been a crossing guard in the city of Pittsburgh for 25 years, and who claims it is the best job she has ever had, and has initiated me into the honorary crossing guards, because if you know anything about Pittsburgh, you don't want to work outside in Pittsburgh. You can see all 4 seasons within an hour, and we were recently voted the second dreariest city in America. The climate's a little challenging, but she says it's wonderful, and here's why.
Good morning. I like you here. Go ahead. Where's your jacket at? You ain't home. Okay. Where's your? I know. See, you got a jacket, huh? He said, I am. Good morning. She's growing up to be so beautiful. Look at her. Wow. I know. Wow. She looks just like you. That's your twin right there. Oh my. Good morning. Y'all go to the high school? Yes. All right. Have a blessed day. You're welcome, baby. And your lips are shimmering. That's that's the worst time when my face is cold. Yeah, it's like, oh mama, shh. Oh, she look this morning. It's just like my hair looks good. My face is cold. Well, hurry up and then it's time to go in, okay? Good morning. Good morning. So when are you gonna know about the election? When you gonna know if you won or not? Oh, hi. I got my fingers crossed for you. You know, I didn't get a cupcake, but I got my fingers crossed. Good morning, guys. Oh, your nails? Let me see your nails. All right, now, let me see y'all look yours. All right, now, go now. Do myself. You cold?
Fall baby.
You a fall baby?
Yeah, my birthday's in November.
See, I hold traffic for you. Good morning, baby girl. I like your little bun. Your mom did your hair? Tell her I give her 100%.
So not necessarily a place you would expect to see leadership and mentoring. But my goodness, every single child who came anywhere close to Miss Paula was seen and heard and acknowledged. They were seen as more than just one thing, and they were shown just a little dose of appreciation in the morning. Now, Miss Paula opened up and said to me, I don't know what happens to all of these children when they get up in the morning, when they come to the crosswalk, and I don't know what happens when they enter the hallways of that school. But I can be in charge of the crosswalk. And we all have our own little crosswalk that we can be in charge of. We all have our own little place where we can make our ripple of appreciation for others. We can make our impact. I think of those ripples as, a still pond, and one raindrop won't affect that entire pond. But when it starts, and we all have our own part to play, that eventually that entire pond is covered in ripples. That we all have an opportunity to bring courage to another person. To be able to show that helpful appreciation. To be able to reflect what is good about one another. That's important day to day. It's certainly important when it comes to working well with others, that we're able to notice what is good and grow from that place as well. Now, the third point is probably the one that's most important. Because the two things that I've shared so far, sure, they can be done here and there, but they're not going to make any lasting difference unless these things are done in an environment of relationships. That the most important thing that we can do to make goodness attractive is to encourage the growth of human relationships by being a model of those relationships and by supporting others to make those same choices in their lives. What we just saw with Miss Paula, those are little relationships budding, because we know that the smallest parts of a relationship are the very simple, everyday interactions that we have with one another. That we could debate what it means to be in relationship all day long, but the way we feel our relationships are moment by moment. It's sometimes the simplest of most mundane interactions that have the deepest impact on us. So what do we see in just that brief moment of interaction from Miss Paula as she's crossing children from one corner to the other? Well, we see a lot. Even in 5 or 10 seconds, we can see a sense of connection. We see children being able to connect emotionally with Miss Paula, even if it's just Miss Paula saying, "Hey, where's your jacket?" Or, getting a little angry because she didn't get a cupcake. They have a connection. They're emotionally engaged with one another. We also see that there's this bit of, we call it reciprocity, back and forth, serve and return, where you can't tell who's really leading because everybody's engaged. Even in 5 seconds, back and forth, we can see that. We see a true sense of inclusion. And when we say inclusion, we mean, what are we doing to be sure that the least likely, the least able, the historically excluded are a part of these relationships? Not just given access to them, but given the support necessary to engage in relationships like this. What are we doing moment to moment to be sure that nobody is left behind, that everybody has a sense of belonging? And finally, even in the smallest of moments, we each have an opportunity to grow. We each have an opportunity to grow in a relationship, to grow in our learning, to grow in our support for one another. That in each one of these relationships, when we break them down into the smallest of moments, we can see these pieces play out when two people are interacting together. But even more than this, we all have an opportunity to think about these things in our moments, but in our day-to-day decisions, whatever they happen to be, whether we're making decisions that impact other people's practices, we're making decisions that impact programs, or maybe we have responsibility for setting policy. If we know that the only way to make goodness attractive is to encourage human relationships, then everything that we do should be in service of those human interactions and relationships. So with every decision that we make, how does anything that we do serve to encourage, enrich, and empower human interactions and relationships around others? Because we can also take the flip side of this question. What is it that we're doing that is possibly discouraging or disempowering people from relating to one another? Because without human relationships, we don't have the power of being able to see and acknowledge one another as more than one thing. Without human relationships, we can't see the good in other people. That the most important thing we can bring to the world, to our neighbors, to one another, are the power of these simple, everyday interactions and relationships that serve the learning and growing of not only ourselves, but of every person who comes near our ripple. So how do we make goodness attractive? I think it starts here. I think it starts with each and every one of us. Because I don't know that anything I presented today is outside of our capacity to make change. That we could turn to someone next to us right now and start this process very easily. And my guess is you're doing a lot of this already. You may not notice. Life gets pretty busy, gets complicated. But sometimes what's most important is what is most simple in our world. That Fred Rogers reminds us that what is simple and deep is far more essential than what is shallow and complex. How do we focus in on what's simple and deep about what we do in service of others? Selfishly, I'd like to end tonight with my favorite Fred Rogers speech. Now, there's a lot of Fred Rogers speeches. One thing I failed to mention is at the Fred Rogers Center, we house the Fred Rogers Archive, which to date is about 22,000 items from Fred's life. Not only did he write every single script of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he had a degree in music composition, so he wrote every piece of music for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He also returned hundreds of thousands of letters every single year. We have all of that correspondence. We have his writings. What I love the most are his speeches, because his speeches are meant for us. They're meant for the adults who continue to extend this work far beyond the neighborhood. Now, this speech was Fred's final commencement address. We didn't know it was going to be his final commencement address, but it was. And coincidentally, it brought him full circle. He started his collegiate career at Dartmouth, transferred after a year to Rollins College because he wanted to study music. But this last commencement address was at Dartmouth. And if we think of when this was, there's a particular reason, outside of me being selfish and wanting to watch it, that I want to share it with you tonight. For those of you who are students in the room, this commencement address was given in the spring of 2002, which means the senior year for these students in September would have been 9/11. So these students are graduating into a world that they didn't expect. Many of you are right now college students living in a world that you didn't expect. It doesn't mean it's a time for us to pause. It means it's a time for us to dig deeper. And Fred challenges all of us to do that. And in this speech, he gives us 3 points. You can see we've got a thing with threes here at the center. But he gives us 3 points that are the greatest gifts of all, that come near the end. Now, when I start this, he has just gotten done singing It's You I Like for the entire graduating class. So the song that we ended with Jeffrey Erlinger, he just sang that to the entire graduating class. But instead of the wheelchair, it was your caps and gowns. They're just beside you. And this is his explanation for what it means to say it's you I like and you are special. And then his challenge to each of us of how we can continue to make goodness attractive.
It's not the honors and the prizes and the fancy outsides of life which ultimately nourish our souls. It's the knowing that we can be trusted, that we never have to fear the truth, that the bedrock of our lives from which we make our choices is very good stuff. There's a neighborhood song that is meant for the child in each of us, and I'd like to give you the words of that song right now. It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair, but it's you I like. The way you are right now, the way down deep inside you. Not the things skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. I hope that you remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like, it's you yourself, it's you. It's you I like. And what that ultimately means, of course, is that you don't ever have to do anything sensational for people to love you. When I say it's you I like, I'm talking about that part of you that knows that life is far more than anything you can ever see or hear or touch. That deep part of you that allows you to stand for those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed. So in all that you do, in all of your life, I wish you the strength and the grace to make those choices which will allow you and your neighbor to become the best of whoever you are. Congratulations to you all.
You never have to do anything sensational for others to love you. And that's what we can extend to one another. Our decisions that help our neighbors to become the best of who they can be. That through these relationships, we can work together to make goodness attractive and to fight for these greatest gifts of all. Thank you for learning alongside me with Fred Rogers tonight. I hope that those of you that this was your first introduction, that this isn't your last, that you dig a little deeper, because there's so much that he provided to us as children that resonates so much as adults, because these lessons weren't meant to end at the age of 8, but they were lessons for across human development. So I thank you for learning alongside me tonight as we reflected a little bit on some of the things that I've learned from Fred Rogers.
So we have some time to ask Dr. Winters some questions. And so I encouraged you to think about questions that you might have. But I'd like to begin while you're collecting your thoughts. You talked about, Dr. Winters, about how kindness means more than just being nice to people. And another word that I heard you use quite a few times is empathy. And I wonder if you can help to define empathy for us as well.
It's a great question. I think those are terms we hear a lot now. We hear kindness, we hear empathy. So I explained a little bit of Fred's vision of kindness, which was deeper than just being nice to one another. That was a part of it, but it went deeper. And that depth of understanding becomes the core of empathy. The core of empathy is being able to attempt and try to understand something from another person's perspective. We may never fully understand, but empathy is action. Empathy is the attempt at trying. Empathy is seeing another person as more than just one thing. So when we think about empathy, it means truly humbling ourselves to listen, humbling ourselves to understand, not listen to reflect, but listen to truly understand. And knowing that we might not be able to experience that same thing, but that we can come to walk alongside in that path.
Thank you for that response. What questions do we have from you all, and I'll encourage you to raise your hands, and so that we can all hear it, I'll probably repeat your question into the microphone. What other questions do we have from this group for Dr. Winters? Alex? Actually, go ahead. I think everybody could hear.
He did. So he would talk about the collective response and the collective responsibility that we have for one another. And the way that he did that was he would show and demonstrate quite often through the program. But then through his speeches, he talked often about how we all have the responsibility to look out for one another. And so when it comes to things like bullying or actions against some of our, he would call them neighbors, of course, but our community, that we all have the responsibility to say something, to stand up, and to create an environment of trust, create an environment of love and understanding. And so when he would, it felt like he was talking directly to us sometimes as individuals, but he was very much hoping that then those ripples would happen. It was always, some of these lessons were learned through the neighborhood of make-believe. So those of you who have not seen Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the neighborhood of make-believe was puppets that would handle incredibly difficult topics that are not seen in children's television programming, topics such as divorce and death. There's one special right after the assassination of Robert Kennedy where Daniel Tiger looks at Lady Aberlin and says, "What is assassination?" And they talk about that. And what it shows is the power of a neighborhood, the power of a community to come together. There's 1 week of episodes around food insecurity and how neighborhoods can come together and communities can come together to provide for one another. So it was teaching these lessons, but it was also a chance for children to catch a lot of the lessons by seeing them in action.
What other questions do we have? Yes, Cheryl? So the question is about advice from Mr. Rogers to educators in this time. Thank you, Cheryl.
Such an important question. It has been, my goodness, has the last 18 months been difficult for our educators in particular. It's been difficult for a lot of people. I like to say we went through a collective experience, but not a common experience, so none of us really know what our neighbor has gone through. But I, over the last 18 months, have been reflecting on Fred's words when people would ask him, "Oh my goodness, things have changed so much. How can you say that what you were talking about 30 years ago is still relevant now?" And his response was always, "The outsides of childhood have certainly changed, but the inner needs of children remain the same. And that inner need begins with knowing that they are loved." And what I've been telling educators is the outsides of our classrooms, the outsides of how we educate, it's really different right now. But the inner needs of children have not changed. And educators are uniquely able to provide for the needs of children. And that will change how they do that, sure. But they know how to meet children's needs of being loved, being cared for, because for children to love learning, they must know they are loved. And that hasn't stopped. I have grown a little tedious with the whole, we've got to make up for lost time. We didn't lose any time. Time looked different, but we didn't lose any time. We've learned a lot. And just as the world abruptly stopped in March of 2020, we've got to take our time now to get back to the healing and understanding and being there for our children and for our families and for our educators. So the advice I would give to educators is they know how to meet the needs of children still. Might look a little different. But what you saw on screen from Fred Rogers wasn't that he was uniquely skilled on the television. It was that he understood the needs of children. So do our educators.
Other questions? What other questions do we have from this group? Perhaps have time for one more. Yes, Izzy? It's a good question. How did Mr. Rogers go from studying music composition to knowing all the details about how they'll learn to read and develop?
If you asked Fred, he'd tell you it was guided drift. But so yes, he studied music composition, and spring break of his senior year of college, went home, and his family had a television, and he sat down and watched it, and he saw a children's television program where they were throwing pies in faces, and it was meant to be funny. It wasn't very funny to him, and he said, "I'm going to go into television now," and got a job at NBC in New York City. Started off as, he would call him the gopher. He'd go for this and go for that. And coincidentally, he was colorblind, so when they would say, like, "Fred, get the red box," he made friends very quickly. So he built relationships very quickly there. But he started looking at television and thought he could do better. Now, he was planning to go into ministry. He was planning to be a Presbyterian minister, so he was going to enroll at seminary. And he put that off, and then when they were starting the first public broadcast station in Pittsburgh, WQED, he left NBC to come back and help them start a television station that they didn't know was going to be successful. And at the same time started his seminary. When he was ordained, he said he wanted to work with children. And they said the only way you're going to be allowed to work with children is if you go to the University of Pittsburgh and work with Dr. Margaret McFarland. If any of you study early childhood here, do you know the name Benjamin Spock and Eric Erickson? So at the time at the University of Pittsburgh, Benjamin Spock and Eric Erickson and Margaret McFarland were all working together. Had it been a different time, those names that you would know would be Margaret McFarland, then Benjamin Spock, then Eric Erickson. But Margaret McFarland started a child development center and was observing children's behavior and working with educators, and was Fred's confidant for close to 20 to 30 years. We have 387 tapes of their conversations that we are right now going through and transcribing, learning an awful lot about child development in the process. But when he was ordained, he wanted to continue his television work, and the Presbyterian Church ordained him to minister to children through television. Now, I've watched 895 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He never said God. He never said Jesus. He never said gospel. He never said anything that you would expect a Presbyterian minister to talk about. Instead, he was able to preach the values of humanity to the point that I had to ask a Buddhist magazine not to print that he was Buddhist. Because they're like, but he exemplifies what we live for. Yes, but he wasn't Buddhist. There are a lot of faiths that claim him because he ministered to children about what children needed and how we can best meet those needs. And that doesn't know a faith family. That is universal. So I bet you didn't expect that kind of path to get there. But he studied at the University of Pittsburgh in child development. He studied with Margaret McFarland, and 30 years later was producing almost 900 episodes of a television program. So it just shows that what you're doing now might not be what you're doing 30 years from now.
Well, thank you all. I'd like to ask Dr. Winters one last question that we often ask our presenters. If you could go back and talk to your, say, 18 or 20-year-old self. You are a professor and educator. You direct the Fred Rogers Center. You're a researcher. You've traveled. Most of the folks who are here today and who are tuned in online are probably college age. What advice would you give your 18 or 20 or 22-year-old self?
Wow. I think if I could go back now, I didn't expect to be doing this either. I didn't expect to answer this question, but I also didn't expect to be where I am now. Fred certainly didn't expect to be where he was. I think if I were to go back and give myself a piece of advice, it would be the same advice I've gotten as I've run the center, which is to listen more. I think when I was 18 or 20, I knew it all. I was ready to take on the world. I was going to solve all the world's problems. Just ask me. I would have told you all about it. I was a state debate champion, so I like to argue. I like to be heard. I like to be heard far more than I liked to hear. And I wish I could go back and tell myself to listen more, to find that humility to understand and seek understanding before seeking a response. I think that would have done me well. It's something I learned a little later than I should have.
Well, on that note, thank you, Dr. Winters. Thank you all for being here, and to those of you who have joined us in person, to our participants online, we want to thank you and wish you a wonderful evening. If you do have a moment, please just drop in and say a quick hello to Dr. Winters and to me before you depart. But please take your crayons and the many lessons that we've learned this afternoon, and have a good evening. Thank you.